Welcome, everyone. This is the 24th Goodman Lecture presented by Kensei Foundation. My name is Trent Walker. I'm a member of Kensei Foundation Academic Development Committee. Today's talk, as all of you know, is by Professor Sangseraima Ujeed, a dynamic scholar of Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhism. Her lecture is titled Land of the Jowos, Buddhist Temples in Mongolia as the Embodiment of Statehood. The Goodman Lectures are an online series. Many of you have joined us here before. It's designed to build bridges between academic and general audiences interested in Buddhist studies. This lecture, as well as all of the 23 past talks in the series, both those in English as well as those in Chinese, are made freely available on Kensei Foundation's website and social media channels. This series is inspired by a longtime friend and advisor of Kensei Foundation, Professor Stephen Goodman, who passed away in 2020. And this series tries to reflect Stephen's enduring vision of making academic talks sponsored by the Foundation available to all. Kensei Foundation, again, as many of you here know, was established by Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, and it's been supporting Buddhist study and practice since 2001, including through grants, scholarships, and other collaborations. For more information, please visit us at www.kenseifoundation.org. As usual for these events, we'll have a period of discussion after the talk. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, to ask a question, please submit it to KF Q&A in the chat box. I'll then relay selected questions directly to our speaker. So we are extraordinarily fortunate here at the Kensei Foundation that we get to partner with universities all across the world that have Buddhist studies programs. One of those programs is at the University of Michigan, where our speaker today, Dr. Sangseraima Ujeed, is Assistant Professor of Tibetan Buddhism. This is a position that's been funded by the Foundation. I happen to be in a completely different set of circumstances, be very lucky to be in the same department as her. So the speaker today happens to be my colleague. And I can let all of you know that Professor Ujeed is an extremely popular professor here on campus for her classes on Tibetan Buddhism, other areas in Buddhist studies, on Mongolian language and culture. She taught a course not too long ago that introduced students to classical Mongolian. She has a wonderful course on the Dalai Lamas, and I've been very intrigued and want to know more about one of the courses that she teaches here called What is Buddhist Practice? That's been particularly engaging and powerful for students who have a chance to take these courses with her. Before coming to the University of Michigan, Dr. Ujeed was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara. This was a position funded by the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation. Before that, her education from the undergraduate level up to the DPhil, her doctorate that she earned in the University of Oxford, was all in the United Kingdom. From SOAS, some study at the University of Cambridge, and several degrees at Oxford. Throughout her time in her studies and beyond, she's received a variety of fellowships in the US as well as in the UK. She has also published a number of articles and book chapters. Some of these have come out of her dissertation, that one aspect of that focused on the first Zaya Pandita Lobsang Trunli. This is a very important Galuh scholar in 17th century Khalkha Mongolia, but also situating that within the broader context of Mongolian and Tibetan Buddhist life writing, including the Namtar genre and other kinds of important genres in this context, as well as other pieces that she's published that I've particularly enjoyed reading, have dealt with questions of vegetarianism among contemporary Tibetan Buddhists, as well as decolonial interventions in Tibetan and Buddhist studies. Dr. Ujeed is an expert in Mongolian and Tibetan sources, but she's also trained in a variety of other languages, including Chinese, Sanskrit, Pali, and Manchu. We are very lucky today that we might, I think, as far as I understand through the topic of this talk, that we'll get to see some of the incredible pictures and documentation that Dr. Ujeed and her colleagues have been doing on monasteries from the very early period of Buddhism in Mongolia. This part of this is coming through a project that she may speak more to us about called Centering the Northern Realms, integrating histories and archaeologies of the Mongol Empire from 1200 to 1500 of the Common Era. This has been a multi-year project of the humanities collaboratory here at the University of Michigan that Dr. Ujeed has been leading along with a number of her other colleagues. The book in progress that Professor Ujeed is working on is called Mirror of Lives, Tibetan Buddhism, Lineage and Identity in Early Modern Inner-Asia. And I know myself and others are really looking forward to this book and its contributions to how to understand the process of life writing, lineage in Tibetan Buddhist context within Tibet, Mongolia, and beyond. So without further ado, I just want to say I'm so delighted that Professor Ujeed, you're here today to join us. So please join me in welcoming her. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for joining us here today. And I also just want to thank the Kensei Foundation for the lasting support of Buddhism and Buddhist studies all around the world. And I feel so fortunate to be part of the network of global scholars, as well as being grateful that I have this position, which is so kindly endowed by the Kensei Foundation. And thank you, Trent, for inviting me to give this talk. I know there was a rescheduling, so I take full responsibility for that. And also, for those of you who are Tibetan Buddhists out there, I know there are some in the room, it's a very auspicious Guru Rinpoche day. So again, I take that as a good sign that this talk will hopefully go well. Before I start, I did want to say a couple of words about this project that Trent so mentioned a few moments ago. Unfortunately, our website is currently not up and running because we're filling it with content at the moment, but I hope in due course I can share it with anyone who's interested. And the project, which has been going on for now 3 years, is in the final and 4th year. And one of the aspects is looking at archaeology and religion, obviously including Buddhism, in Mongolia during the Mongol Empire period. And there's been some very exciting findings that we hope will change our understanding of religion, Buddhism, economics, trade, and cities in Mongolia. But watch that space, it's on its way. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my talk for today. Give me one moment while I share my slides with you. I hope you can all see that. Okay, so as you already know, the title of my talk today is Land of the Jowos, Buddhist Temples in Mongolia as the Embodiment of Statehood. So what does Jowo mean? Oops. So Jowo, written Jowo in Tibetan, as you can see there, literally means Lord. And oftentimes it refers to the Lord Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. A couple of examples from Tibet include the Jowo Rinpoche, meaning the precious Jowo, that's enshrined in the Jokhang temple in Lhasa, as depicted on the left here, and the Jowo Mikö Dorje, which is enshrined in the Ramoche temple, depicted on the right. There are many other examples of this term Jowo being used in the context of bodhisattvas such as Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, and lords or great masters of Tibetan Buddhism throughout history, such as Tsongkhapa, as well as Indian masters such as Atisha, who brought certain practices and traditions of Buddhism to Tibet from India in the 11th century. So that's one context. And if we turn to the Mongolian, it appears as Jo, and it's written as such in the classical Mongolian script. And as well as referring to statues of Buddhas that are enshrined in various temples, it also refers to the temples or monasteries at times themselves. So in one sense, it's both the statue as well as the structure, or simply the structure in the case that there is no particular Buddha statue named as such inside the temple. Some examples include Yikjo, meaning the great Jo, Junjo, meaning the eastern Jo, Shiratjo, meaning the enthroned Jo, Irtenjo, meaning the precious Jo, Otenjo, meaning the Jo made from willow trees, Mederjo. Meder is the Mongolian word for Maitreya, so it's the Jowo of the future Buddha Maitreya, Ushin Jowo, and so forth. There are many more examples, but that is just the list, just to give you an idea. Depicted on the right is the Jowo, the Great Jowo, that's found in the city Orkhon, which is the center of the province of the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region in China, or sometimes referred to as Inner Mongolia. And underneath is the Odunjo, also known as Pekar Chöling in Tibetan, and was a great seat of philosophical debate and philosophical training in Mongolian regions. So, with that, the talk that I'm going to give has the following structure. So I'm going to give a very brief as I can make it, background into the history of Buddhism in Mongolia. Then I'm going to jump into the beginning of the Gaelic school or the Gaelic tradition spread amongst the various Mongolian regions. And in this section is where the Jowos come in, the temples and the Buddha statues. The main point I'm trying to make through this talk is that these Jowos were built in Mongolia by the various patrons, most of them being princes or known in Mongolian as Khans, as the center of their realm and the embodiment of their state, or so they hoped. This project, or rather this talk, is part of a larger project I'm working on, which is in fact my book project. And the larger project also examines along those lines and tries to investigate the beginning of Gaelic schools' proliferation amongst the Mongols, to reframe the story of the Mongols as the passive recipients of Tibetan Buddhism, which is a story and a narrative that has continued to define the way Buddhism among the Mongols has been understood and continues to be. So that's kind of the framing of the larger book project. Despite what Trent mentioned earlier, I have moved on and it's a slightly different project, but currently I don't have a working title for the book that I'm willing to share yet. So again, watch that space. Hopefully in the next couple of years, it'll be complete and published. All right, so next, in order to talk about the background of Buddhism amongst the Mongols, there are a couple of mythbusters, as I like to call them, which are, there was a dark age of Buddhism in Mongolia, and this refers to a dark age, not in the sense that there was no light, but rather there was a period amongst the Mongols where there was no Buddhism whatsoever. I'll get to the details of that in just a moment. The second is that because of this dark age, when Buddhism started exploding in Mongolia during the 16th century, this period is referred to as the second conversion of the savage and uncivilized Mongols by the third Dalai Lama Sonam Gyatso, starting in 1577. So this depiction of the Mongols as savage and uncivilized is a common narrative found actually in the writings by Mongolians themselves sometimes in the Tibetan language. Again, I'll go into a bit more details about that in just a moment. And the third mythbuster is that Mongols were and are passive recipients of Tibetan Buddhism. All right, before I bust these myths, I know many of us are familiar in the room today, but just to give you the structure of what we're calling Tibetan Buddhism, it can be categorized into, number one, Nyingma or Sarma. Nyingma means the ancient tradition, and Sarma means the new transmission. So into this falls the latest schools of Tibetan Buddhism that formed in Tibet. So what are these schools? Number two, they're generally divided into four principal schools. There are more, but let's just stick to these for today. There's the Nyingma, following the early transmission that can be dated to the 8th century. The Sakya and Kagyu later during the Sarma or the new period in the 10th and 11th centuries. And the youngest tradition of Tibetan Buddhism or school of Tibetan Buddhism is the Gelug, dates to 1407, following the life and times of its founder, Nje Dzongkhapa. They can also be divided into the red hat and yellow hat. The red at times can mean just the Nyingma, or sometimes also a mix of Nyingma, Sakya, or Kagyu, and that has changed throughout history. Whereas the yellow school, or the yellow hat school, has always referred to the Gelug tradition. So these schools of Buddhism that developed and evolved in Tibet aren't unique to Tibet alone, but are also found across the Himalayas in the various Himalayan nations, such as Bhutan and Nepal, Sikkim, and so forth. And there's just some examples of what's found in Bhutan. And then in Mongolia, which again, as I mentioned, it's often referred to as Mongols are Tibetan Buddhists. The forms of Buddhism found there are yellow hat predominantly, but there are also some red hat traditions around, especially starting in the Mongol Empire period in the 13th century. But again, much of today's talks can be focused on the start of the yellow hat, the Gaelic tradition among Mongols. All right. So, again, before I get to the Mythbusters, it's just important to give a little bit of the background of when Buddhism started amongst the Mongols, at least the version for which we have textual sources, is during the Mongol Empire period and the subsequent Mongol Yuan Empire period. So on the left is a diagram showing the family tree of Chinggis Khan, who founded the Mongol Empire. And if we go down to the time of his grandsons, and you can see in the colorful writings, the various Tibetan Buddhist schools that these princes, who some of them later became Hans, became patrons of, built alliances with, which include the Jigum, the Karma Kagyu, Salpa Kagyu, the Sakyas, the Taklungpas, and the Pagmuju traditions. Important for our talk is particularly the relationship that was built between Hublai Khan, who founded the Yuan Empire, or the Yuan dynasty that ruled over all of China, who built an alliance with the Sakya tradition, and especially the Sakya Pakpa Lama, who was then the religious leader of the Sakya school. And they worked together in this patron-priest model where Hublai Khan governed his state with Pakpa Lama as his personal teacher, as well as the state preceptor for the entire Yuan dynasty. This will become significant as we get to the 16th century, because this is a model, like a storyline, that is brought back to life and given rebirth to in the way monasteries and temples started to be founded amongst the Mongols. All right, on to our Mythbusters. So this initial period of Buddhism's spread in Mongolia during the 13th century is said to have carried on until 1386, which marks the fall of the Yuan Empire. And the following period, for about 200 years, is said to have been devoid of Buddhism altogether. So Hublai Khan and Pakpa, they worked together to establish at least 50 Buddhist temples all across Yuan China and Mongolian homeland. It also became the established tradition for Yuan emperors, the Khagans, to receive the Hevajra Tantra initiation on the occasion of their enthronement. They received multiple initiations from lamas of the Sakya tradition, and we have some evidence which suggests that they were practicing Buddhism, not simply having it as a token of a civilized great nation. So all of these efforts are said to have completely disintegrated after the great Yuan Empire fell. So this is the period that's referred to as the Dark Age or the Dark Period. And it ended, well, it began with the reign of the last Yuan Han, Togontumur, depicted over here. So I'm about to demonstrate why this was definitely not the case. So among the many examples I could share with you, but I'll refrain from in order to get to the main section of today's talk, is material remains and other pieces of evidence that point to Buddhism having not only survived, but as being continued to be practiced by the Mongolian nobility, the princes, the princesses, and the rulers in various Mongol regions during the so-called Dark Period. Oh, one element I forgot to mention is the Dark Period is also called that because of the lack of written sources that were compiled during this 200-year period. So it's true, there's very few sources from this period, but looking at some of the material evidence, such as cave monasteries. One example is known as the Archai grottos, depicted here. It's a red sandstone mountain that's flat-topped, and inside are said to be 108 cave temples. And on the walls of these cave temples, there are depictions of Sakya Pandita, clearly the Sakya affiliation. There's also 108 stupas that surround this cave monastery site. And inside some of the other caves, there's also depictions of the Sakya pantheon of high Tantra meditation deities. So there are other examples, but this is probably one of the most colorful ones that I had the fortune of visiting a few years ago, just before the pandemic. And this is situated in the southern part of the Gobi. And the other examples also come from various regions of the Gobi, which suggests that during the 15th century, which is how the period to which the site is being dated to currently, the Mongols who inhabited this region continued to practice Buddhism. So it was not dark where they were. Other evidence comes from records of the Ming dynasty, known as the Ming Shilu. And in there, we can draw out pieces of occasions, or draw out occasions when Buddhist monks from the Tibetan tradition were acting as envoys between various Mongolian groups and the Ming court, requesting sutras, requesting Buddhist statues, and materials for building monasteries. So we don't know exactly whether these people were Tibetan or Mongols, but we know that there was Buddhist activity that among the Mongols that required the support of the Ming dynasty for texts and so forth. The last example I'll give for Buddhism's survival during the Dark Age is the cave monks, or are the cave monks. So there are many such individuals who carry the title Dhyanchi, meaning one who partakes in the practice of dhyana, i.e. forms of meditation, or Yugutsur, which is the Mongolian for Yogacharya, a master of the tantric practices. So some examples include Chakhardiyanch, Chagandiyanch, Olandiyanch, and I won't bore you with too many Mongolian terms for names of these individuals, but these figures are found all across Mongolian lands, especially in the mountains surrounding Pukhot, the city that we'll be looking at in more detail, that contains many temples from the 16th century. So Guihua is the older name of the city, and here is a picture of one of the caves where a particular cave monk spent over 25 years doing meditation, as well as supporting the local community of Buddhists in this region, which is today situated in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. So this map here shows the various Mongolian regions from 1550 to 1600. Here you can also see where the cave monastery site from the last slide is located in a region known as Ortus, which sits in the southern Gobi region. And in terms of how the Mongols divided themselves, they were divided into two main groups. So one group was known as the Western Tumen, translates as the Western 10,000s, and they included three groups: the Ortus, the Tumid, and the Yungshabu or Harchin. They are combined as one. So these are just administrative units of groups of people, groups of Mongolians that had or were occupying these territories. So the Western Tumen was governed by a figure known as Altan Han. Here's a statue of him from Pukhot, the city that he built. His name literally means the golden one. And the Eastern Tumen, which includes Halch, Horchin, and Chachar, were governed by the Hagan. And at this point in history, it was the Tumen Jasaktan. Image of him is over here. So our story is going to now move towards Altan Han and his life and deeds and activities, because he was the first to start building temples in Mongolian regions. And the first one would be built in the Tumut region, highlighted here in green, surrounding what would become his city and the center of his realm. So, who was Altan Han? So, Altan Han, according to the popular narrative that's often repeated in history books about Buddhism in Mongolia and the Gaelic tradition, is often described as he who brought the savage and uncivilized Mongols into the second conversion of Buddhism, thereby illuminating the Mongolian lands. And this all happened because he was converted by the third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso. However, as we will see, Altan Han and the other members of his close circle and family members were already deeply familiar with the Buddhist tradition, its history, its doctrine, and practices. So this beginning of Gaelic schools spread throughout Mongols was carefully planned by Altan Khan and his family and was orchestrated by them instead of simple Mongols being converted by the Tibetan Buddhists. So we know that Altan Khan had access to Buddhist knowledge and Buddhists because where he was situated is surrounded by mountains with the cave monks and the yogis. Not all of these were Mongols, some of them were Tibetans. So as well as spending a significant number of years doing retreat there, they did have access to society. It wasn't that they were completely segregated in these caves. And they also represented more than one tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So we can safely say that Altan Khan was far from being completely unfamiliar with Buddhism, or at least of the Tibetan tradition. We also know from the Ming records that Altan Khan had Chinese Buddhist monks serving in his court. So again, he was familiar with the form of Buddhism that was being practiced and spread in China as well. So if he already had access to Buddhism and Buddhist practitioners who are more than well trained, then why did he go to the Gaelic tradition and why did the Mongols become part of the Gaelic school? So let me tell you a little bit more about Altan Khan and his history. So Altan Khan was a 33rd generation descendant of Chinggis Khan and the grandson of Dain Khan, who had successfully unified the Eastern Mongol groups into some semblance of a united state for the first time since the fall of the Great Yuan dynasty in 1386. Like his grandfather, Altan pursued a military career and continued to further consolidate the power of his Western Tumen group of Mongols that he ruled over. In the year 1571, which was exactly 52 years after he first rode into battle at the age of 12, Altan Khan dismounted from his war horse and laid down his sword for the final time. At this point, he was 64 years old, which was no small feat for a Mongolian ruler, especially a military one of his times. Having emerged victorious from 45 battles, he had secured the rulership over his Western Tumen Mongols and the position of his followers as a formidable force in Inner Asia. Not only had he won fame as one of the most powerful men among the Mongols, but his power and might was also recognized by Ming China, and he'd received the highest title of Xunyi Wang from the Ming Emperor and started trading with the Ming. So, at this point in history, Altan Khan was by far one of the most powerful figures in all of Inner Asia and China, but he was not Hagan. And this is where these two terms come in that can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So, Hagan refers to, well, we can translate it as emperor sovereign, and throughout the history of the Mongols, there can only be one Hagan. So that is the Hagan that follows the line of Chinggis Khan, Kublai Khan. The confusing part comes in that in Mongolian, Hagan is pronounced Han with a long R when you're actually reading out loud, which sounds very similar to Han, which is the short R. In any case, so there can only be one Hagan, and that's a hereditary line that's given to the eldest son of the ruling family. Hans, throughout history, referred to more like kings or princes. They still had to belong to the bloodline of Chinggis Khan, but besides the main Hagan, you couldn't have any other great Hagans. So during the Mongol Empire period, there were other Hans, so princes, but by the time of Altan Khan, there really were not many such figures, apart from the main Hagan, i.e. the main ruler of the Mongols. Despite Mongolia being rather segregated, this still remained the practice. So in 1541, Altan, at the time not yet a prince or a Hagan, had supported the ruling Hagan, Tumen Jasat Khan, in securing some victories and essentially saving his life. So in reward, he requested the Hagan to bestow upon himself the title of a king or prince. So this is Han with the short R. So he was one of the first to have this title during the 16th century period, but over the next 30 years, it's clear that his ambitions were not quite quenched. So in the map here, we can see the region that Altan Han had ruled over during his lifetime. And up here highlighted in the blue is the realm of the Great Hagan. Okay, so what was Altan Han after? So despite being someone who belonged to the legitimate bloodline of Chinggis Khan, he had many other brothers as well as uncles who would be next in line for the position of Hagan. So it was very unlikely he would have ever made it there by birthright. So these verses come from the biography of Altan Han, and it's a section which basically comes before he meets the Dalai Lama and starts to take up the Gelug school and spread it throughout his region. It says, "He who was born by the destiny of the highest Tingur, the holy master of the world, Altan Sitchin Han, recalling the incomparable religion and state of Dharma that was established by the supreme Pakpa Lama and Sitchin Hagan." And this verse describes Altan Han as possessing the destiny of Tingur, which is the ancestral deity of the Mongols that has predated Buddhism and its arrival among the Mongols. So what is he recalling? He's recalling the state and the Dharma, i.e. the Buddhism of Sitchin Han. Here is referring to Hoblai, the founder of the Yuan dynasty, and Pakpa Lama being his state preceptor, who's the religious leader of the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. He continues, "Unable to forget by day and sleepless at night, his impartial mind wished for it. And by the power of his previously accumulated merit in the female white sheep year, being 1571, a Lama called Asing arrived." So here's the Han, right now the most powerful man probably in the world as he knew it, is losing sleep because he wants what Sitchin Han, Hoblai Han, and Pakpa Lama had. This is what he desires. He wants to become a ruler that's as great as Hoblai Hagan. So how is he going to achieve it, despite having no birthright claim to it, and there already being a Hagan who's well and alive and continuing that lineage? This is the moment that he turns to the Buddhist tradition. So this is a second Mythbuster, where we're talking about how Buddhism among the Mongols in the 16th century and the proliferation of Gelug school amongst the Mongols is referred to as a second conversion. So I'm crossing that out and calling it the rebirth of Buddhism. So why is it the rebirth of Buddhism? It's owed to the project that Altan Han embarked on. So if Altan wanted to inherit the legacy of Hoblai Han, he can only do so through reincarnation or rebirth. And the only tradition that can provide this is the Buddhist tradition. So, looking to Hoblai Han as a model, he was also seeking a Lama that would be his Pakpa. So here in this mural, we have Hoblai Han with the state preceptor Pakpa on equal balance, governing the state and religion through governance and Buddhism. So, as we already mentioned, Altan Han didn't have a lack of Buddhists around him. So why did he go in search of a new school? So one of the reasons is that the ruling Hagan had continued to support and patronize the Sakya as well as the Kagyu schools of Buddhism that the Mongols had built alliances with back in the 13th century. So in a sense, they were off limits. The people had already claimed them. These cave-dwelling yogis and tantric practitioners in his eyes likely didn't seem like individuals that could provide a sustainable model for government that could support his state. There was lack of organization, and these individuals were practicing as their primary practice, and also had no organized monastery or system that they were part of. So this is when he starts to seek for a new school, and luckily, the youngest school of the Tibetan Buddhist schools, the Gelug, had not quite yet had built strong alliances with Mongolian princes or rulers. So what would soon happen is Altan Khan would be reborn as Kublai Khan, and the third Dalai Lama would become his Pakpa Lama. So although I don't have time to go into the vast history and the background of how this took place, we can say that the Gelug-Mongol interaction was in the form of an alliance, at least on par as equals with one another. And having already been familiar with Buddhism, there was not so much of a conversion to Buddhism going on, but rather a new alliance being built, i.e. the rebirth of a Buddhist tradition in a new form and school. Through this process, Altan Khan's realm and his state would be reborn also as an authentic Buddhist central place, endowed with all of the markers of what makes a central place a central place. So what is a central place? So in the history of Buddhism, since its beginning and throughout its long history, there can be more than one Buddhist central realm or central place. So rebirth is not confined to individuals and identities, but also extends to geographical space that contain Buddhism and Buddhists. In this cosmological geography, the original central realm is Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha became enlightened, and all other regions that didn't possess Buddhism would have been peripheral, savage borderlands, as they were devoid of the Dharma. However, as Buddhism spread, sorry, it's very dry here with the heating. So as Buddhism spread to places such as Sri Lanka, China, and Tibet, by virtue of the Dharma's arrival and flourishing there, these places could also become Buddhist central realms. So this is not without precedent. There are other such examples in Tibet as well as Mongolia, and I'm just going to share a few. So in the Tibetan context, in the 7th century, in 1640, the king Songtsen Gampo, king of Tibet, after successful military campaigns against the Tangut Empire, the Shangshung Kingdom, and the southern parts of Tang China in the Sichuan area as it sits today, he secured Tibet's position as a formidable power, especially to his neighbors in the Indian continent and China, who were all powerful neighbors that possessed Buddhism. So now, having acquired his power, he too would need to possess Buddhism to be their equals. So this led to various efforts by the king to create a Tibetan language based on the Sanskrit script for the purpose of translating Buddhist scriptures into the Tibetan language. As well as these efforts, he also married two princesses, the Chinese princess Wuncheng and the Nepalese princess Burkuti Devi. And it's said that each of them brought with them representations of the Buddha, i.e. statues of the Buddha, which would be enshrined in temples in the center of Songtsen Gampo's realm in Lhasa. So one of these brought by the Chinese princess is the Jowo Rinpoche, the precious jewel, which is enshrined in the Jokhang temple, as depicted here on the right. So together with an authentic image of the Buddha that's seen as no different from the historical Buddha, depicted at the age of 12, it is said, and a home to enshrine it, Lhasa, the center of Songtsen Gampo's realm, where he also built his palace, although this is a new palace that was built by the 5th Dalai Lama in the 1640s, became the center of Tibet and is often described in the sources as the Bodh Gaya in the land of snow, the second Bodh Gaya, creating Tibet as an authentic Buddhist central realm, with the king at the center as an embodiment of a Buddhist monarch. Another example, a couple of generations later, is the Tibetan king Chisung Detsen, who in the 8th century invited Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava and the scholar Shantarakshita and built Tibet's first Buddhist monastery known as Samye. And again, by these acts, he's creating his identity as an authentic Buddhist ruler with a monument, a Buddhist temple, at the center of his government and realm. We turn to Mongolia. During the time of the Mongol Empire and the Yuan Empire, another example can be found. So this is known as the Pavilion of the Rising Yuan, and it was built at the site of Harkhorum, which was the ancient capital city of the Mongol Empire. All that remains today of this city is a stone turtle. I'll be showing a video of it from above in a moment, but really it's green steppe grass as far as the eye can see. But during the height of Mongol power, the city marveled travelers from far and near, and was a product of collaboration between some of the most elite of architects, artists, and craftsmen who were gathered from across the vast empire to build the city of the Mongol Khans. Among all the architectural wonders that stood in the city, the most remarkable was this Pavilion of the Rising Yuan, which is described in a stele that once stood outside it as a 90-meter tall gilded Buddhist pagoda. And here are some artist reconstructions from more recent years. The pagoda was in the center, and there were 7 Buddhist temples surrounding it, and the site constituted the largest and tallest structure to ever stand in the city. It stood in the southwest of the city between the peaks of the 2 mountaintops behind, as depicted on the image on the left. And anyone who rode towards Harkhorum, which sat in the valley shielded by the mountains behind, would be the first thing seen from hundreds of miles away, glistening with the gold roof that it was endowed with. So this past summer, I was there with a group of colleagues and students from the University of Michigan. So we kind of rode, well, we weren't riding, we were driving up to it and was imagining what this thing would look like. And in all truth, from hundreds of miles, you would have been able to see this giant structure. The stele also describes it as comparable to the great temple in Jetavana, where the Buddha taught, and its height to the Himalayas. What was this structure doing for the Mongols? It was built to proclaim the Mongol realm and the power of its rulers to all those who would come into contact with the city. This pagoda, which started in 1235, was completed in 1256. It was renovated in 1311, and the final renovation took place in 1346. On each occasion, it was one of the Mongol Hagans, the main ruler of the Mongols, that would partake and fund these renovation projects, again in line with their goal to present themselves and their realm as an authentic Buddhist realm ruled by an authentic Buddhist king. Jumping forwards to our period in the 16th century, we come to Altan Khan's project, which can be approached as one in a long line of such projects. But as we'll see, it had some significant implications for not only the Mongols or the Tibetans, but as well, not only the Mongols, the Tibetans, but also China and the Qing Empire. So Altan Khan's project to create his realm as an authentic Buddhist realm and himself as not only an authentic Buddhist ruler, but the reincarnation of Kublai Khan, involved bringing authentic representations of the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha, and giving it life in his realm. So today we can only talk about the Buddha or the representation of the Buddha, the Dharma and Sangha component I'm working on in different book chapters, and unfortunately I can't talk too much about them today, but in any case. So for bringing the Jowo, or the Buddha, to his realm, Altan Khan started a city building project, which started in 1572. The city would come to be known as Ujeed, or in English that means a blue city. Here is a picture of it from the late 90s. And in its early days, the city was likely in size about the same, if not smaller, than the Buddhist monastery that Altan Khan was about to build there. So part of this project is Altan Khan manifesting himself as Kublai Khan reborn. So his city too took after this idea, where he built a city modeled on the capital of the Yuan Empire that Kublai Khan established, which is known as Hanbalik or Dadul, or modern-day Beijing. So there's intentionality behind bringing this world to life through the tool of Buddhism. Although it's referred to as Hochot, many sources from the period and immediately after, from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, refer to the city as Altan Khan's Jowo city. The Jowo city, or the city of temples, or city of the Buddha of Altan Khan. At the center of the city was the temple known as Yikjo, meaning the Great Jowo, referring both to the statue of the Buddha that would be enshrined within and the temple structure itself. The scholar Isabel Shalu, an expert of Mongolian Buddhist art and history of Buddhism in Mongolia, described the city as the political brainchild of Altan Khan. And indeed, the city contained the blueprint for the rebirth of a Buddhist statehood and a Buddhist school that Altan Khan envisioned for his people and his descendants. So this all began after Altan Khan meets with Sonam Gyatso, who would be there on known as the third Dalai Lama. And this event took place in 1578. Again, the events that led up to the meeting could be a lecture on its own, but what I can say for the sake of today is that this alliance was again built as equal partners that would benefit both parties involved. The Gaelic school was suffering from a loss of powerful patrons that could support them during a time that Tibet was torn apart by civil war, and many of these factions in the civil unrest were also allied with other Tibetan Buddhist schools. So Sonam Gyatso, who was simply Sonam Gyatso until he met with Altan Khan, was on the lookout for other powerful patrons that could ensure the survival of the Gaelic school. It was exactly at this point that Altan Khan was also looking for a Buddhist Lama, a teacher that could become his Pakpa Lama reincarnated. So a number of letters were exchanged, and the agreement was made that the two would meet at Kökenür, or in Chinese Qinghai, which is located in eastern Tibet or on the border of southern China. So Sonam Gyatso travels all the way from Lhasa, and Altan Khan travels about 2,000 miles from his city in Hochot to the shores of the lake Kökenür, the Blue Lake. And upon their meeting, this is from the biography of the third Dalai Lama written by the fifth Dalai Lama, Altan Khan suddenly fainted, and when he had recovered, he started to recount his previous lives. And he said, "In the bygone time when Pakpa Lama was erecting the temple for the realm, I was Kublai Sachin Khan, and you were Pakpa Lama." So he's talking to Sonam Gyatso, the third Dalai Lama, at this point, and says, "You, Pakpa Dalai Lama, you performed the consecration for my temple, and we have been reincarnating from there until now." So this story in the mainstream books and historical texts in English is often presented as a moment when the Dalai Lama recognized Altan Khan as the reincarnation of Kublai and himself as Pakpa Lama. But the Tibetan as well as the Mongolian sources from the period clearly states that it was Altan Khan who gave himself and the Dalai Lama the status of reincarnation of Kublai and Pakpa. Titles were exchanged, and Altan Khan coined the title Dalai Lama. Dalai meaning ocean in Mongolian is the translation of Gyatso, the last part of the monastic name of the third Dalai Lama. It was, in fact, not really wasn't quite a title, but rather simply the translation of the personal name of Sonam Gyatso, or the monastic name, meaning the ocean of merit. And the entire name was translated in Mongolian, but the Dalai component stuck, and all subsequent Dalai Lamas came to be known as the Dalai Lamas. After their meeting, Altan Khan returns to his city and immediately starts to build his temple. He built his temple and the Buddha enshrined within as no less sacred than the Jowo Śākyamuni of Lhasa and the Jokhang, the temple which enshrines this Buddha statue. Altan Khan's Yukjo would become the center of his realm and the seat of his government for the Mongolians that he governed. So this is the central temple of Yukjo as it stands today. And on the left is an image of the Jowo Śākyamuni Buddha statue that Altan Khan enshrined within. It was completed around 1579. There's been some disagreements among scholars regarding exactly what the Jowo might refer to. If we look at the Tibetan case, the Lhasa Jowo resides in the Jokhang temple, Jokhang literally meaning the house of the Jowo. So in a sense, it can refer to both the statue and the temple complex. For Buddhists, especially those belonging to the Tibetan schools, statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that are consecrated should be housed within an appropriate temple or monastery. A couple of years ago, when I was traveling in the southern region of Mongolia, an old monk was complaining to me about a new Guru Padmasambhava statue that had been erected outside of the temple. He said something along the lines of, the degenerate ages come when Buddhas stand outside without a roof over their heads, perfectly capturing this sentiment. So if the Jokhang in Lhasa occupies a position of the most sacred temple in Tibet and the most holy object of worship, then in Hukhot, the city of Altan Khan, the Yikjo, the Great Jowo temple and the Buddha within was created to house, so as a seat of the center of Altan Khan's Buddhist realm. As for the blueprint of Yikjo, instead of looking to a model in Hublai, his claimed previous incarnation, Altan Khan built his monastery as his own architectural innovation. Again, the scholar Isabel Shalu describes the structure as a Sino-Tibetan style of Hukhot that had never been seen before, and it combined the artisanship of China and Tibet in a manner that was unique for this period. So unlike his reincarnate identity, this monastery, this temple and the jewel within was Altan Khan's alone. It belonged to him and was his innovation for creating himself as the legitimate ruler of his realm. The structure was built about half a kilometer southwest of the city as it was at the time. And as mentioned already, the city and the temple were about the same size in the early days. So from the moment that the temple was built, it became the inexplicable hallmark of the city, and it was at the heart of Altan Khan's state building project. Unfortunately, not long after the completion of the monastery in 1582, Altan Khan passed away, and this started a chain reaction of events that would both build his legacy and undo everything that he had worked during his life to build. And just to give you an idea of the Buddha statue in comparison to the Buddha statue in Lhasa, on the right, we have the Jowo Śākyamuni from the Lhasa Jokhang, and on the left, there's the Jowo statue in the Yikjo temple. So you can see there's definite similarities, even to the details of the dragons that frame the Buddha that sits in front. Soon after Altan Khan passed away, the unity of the Western Tumen Mongols that he governed over started to disintegrate. his descendants, as well as the rulers of the various other Mongolian groups that made up the Western Tumen, started to vie for their own power to build their own state, and Altan Khan had provided them with the model. So, as mentioned already, there was really no other Khans in the Long R, princes, who carried that title until Altan Khan. And by claiming himself to be the reincarnation of Hublai, he'd raised himself to the status of a Hagan. If Hublai was a Hagan, Altan too, as his reincarnation, could have access to that title and position. But with his death, then many other princes started to build alliances with the Dalai Lama and his disciples from the Gaelic school, and requested and gained title for themselves of Khan. What did they do next? Very similar to Altan Khan, following in his footsteps, they started to build temples, Buddhist temples, as the center of their realms, and they all had in their names Jowo. So this is where the beginning of temples carrying Jowo in their names among Mongolian lands come from. And after some time, even temples that didn't enshrine a Buddha statue within would simply be called XYZ Jowo. We'll see some examples in just a moment. And they were serving, or they were intended to serve the similar purpose to what Altan Khan had envisioned for his city and realm. So, after Altan Khan's death, his son Singadurung inherited the title of Khan, as well as the Shunyuan title bestowed by the Ming court. And in 1586, he consecrated the land to build his own Jowo temple, which was to be called Jowo. Unfortunately, he too died that very same year, long before the construction project began. But the intention was out there in order to follow in his father's footsteps. This was a moment when, even among the descendants of Altan Khan, his various sons and grandsons were starting to fight amongst themselves in order to gain and inherit the position that Altan Khan had built. So Altan Khan's grandson, the next ruler of the Western Tumen Mongols, was called Namodai Sichin. And although he had inherited the title and the seal, his power only extended to about half of this group of Mongols at the time. There were competition among his cousins and siblings. So what did he do? He builds another Jowo temple, which came to be known as Shiret Jowo, that was built on the site that was consecrated by his father. That would have been called Erten Jowo. In this temple, he, i.e. Altan Khan's grandson, constructed the reliquary stupa to enshrine the relics of his grandfather Altan Khan, and then he began the project of establishing his own Jowo temple. He chose the location only 100 feet east of Altan Khan's Jowo temple, and it was planned so that the Dalai Lama would one day be enthroned as the abbot of the monastery. And accordingly, the temple was titled Shiret Jowo, the throne Jowo. At this point in history, the Mongols, the descendants of Altan Khan, had also invited the third Dalai Lama to Mongolia to consecrate these temples that they'd started constructing, as well as to carry out the final funerary rites of Altan Khan. We'll get to when the Dalai Lama arrives in just a moment. But as the disintegration of the Mongol state that Altan Khan had built continued, then so did the construction of various Jowo temples by the competing factions. So another example is Meder Jowo, and this was built during the time of Altan Khan's grandson Namodai Sichin, who had divorced his first wife, Machik Hatun, and she proceeded to marry another one of Altan Khan's sons called Buddha Shri, who had also been vying for the throne and the top position of power among the Western Tumen Mongols. So they built their own Jowo temple in challenge of Namodai Sichin and his Shiret Jowo temple that we saw in the last image. And very intentionally, they built this competing Jowo temple on the site where Altan Khan had once built a palace. So this temple, known as Medir Jowo, the Maitreya Jowo, was built in 1606. And as you can see from the pictures, it resembles more of a fortress with the temple within it, which reflects the origins of the site as a fortified palace structure, rather than simply starting off as a Buddhist temple. The disintegration didn't just stop there among the direct descendants of Altan Khan, but various grandnephews, seeing this disintegration take place, also hoped to gain their position during the various conflicts. So another example from 1606, which is also built within the city limits of the city of Hukhot, is Bagajo, meaning the little Jo. And this was built by another descendant of Altan Khan, this time a great-great-grandson known as Ombo Hongtej. And he had allied with one of the factions, and in reaction to the disunity, intended to strengthen his position against his rivals. And his building of the Bagjo temple is the embodiment of what was going on. However, at this point, we have many temples that have enshrined Buddha statues. So he looked to a different example. And he took as a model the Buddha statue of Buddha Akshobhya that's enshrined in the Ramoche temple, depicted on the right, again in Lhasa. And he enshrined this Buddha Akshobhya inside his Bagajo temple in challenge of the other factions that were attempting the same thing at this point. So by this point in 1606, there were already 4 Jowo temples just within the city limits of Hukhot, all built by individuals that wanted to follow in the footsteps of Altan Khan and build themselves as a Khan and a ruler of this particular faction of the Mongols. It didn't just stop there, and this phenomena and its replication, the model that Altan Khan created being copied by other princes and rulers across Mongolia, spread throughout the rest of the Mongol regions too. Again, there are too many examples to share comprehensively, so I'm just going to share a few. And the next one is the region of Ortus, which, as if you remember, this is where the cave temple, the Sakya cave temple, is located, but was ruled during Altan Khan's time by some of his closest allies, and traditionally would have been included as part of the Western Tumen Mongols that Altan Khan ruled over. As soon as Altan Khan died, the Ortus rulers again took the model that Altan Khan had created and started to build Jowo temples in Ortus. So these temples were also constructed as homes of various Jowo statues of the Buddha. And just as Altan Khan had done, the then ruler of Ortus, known as Boshik Jinung, commissioned a silver statue of the Buddha, depicted also as a 12-year-old boy, and enshrined it inside his temple, representing, or rather embodying, his separation from the Western Tumen and his intention to build his realm as independent and himself as the authentic Buddhist ruler at its center. Therefore, this temple that he built during his lifetime also became the center of the Ortus Confederation and the seat of governing the region. So here are some images from the temples of Ortus. In total, over the next 30 years, there came to be 23 temples called Jowo in just the Ortus region alone. So this phenomena didn't just stop within the realm that Altan Khan had governed or among his descendants and close allies. The influence stretched as far north as Halych Mongolia, or what's known today as Mongolia the country, or sometimes also referred to as Outer Mongolia. So one example is Abba Han, who was related through marriage to Altan Han and his family. And again, hearing about Altan Han's death, he started to investigate what was going on in Altan Han's realm. In the early 1580s, the third Dalai Lama is invited back to Hukhot, Altan Han's city. And hearing about this news, Abba Han traveled from Halach, Mongolia, where he was situated, to meet with the Dalai Lama. Why did he do so? At this point, Abba Han was not yet Han. He had prevailed as the most powerful figure in northern Mongolia, yet he had not yet possessed the title to go with it. So upon meeting the Dalai Lama, he requests for a Han title. He's given the Han title. He's also recognized as the reincarnation of an important Buddhist figure from the history of Buddhism in the Himalayas. He's given a relic of the Buddha, which he takes back to Mongolia, his homeland, and he starts to embark on his own project. And this would end up as Irten Jowo, the precious jewel. So the central temple, as you see, was built by Abba Han, and the two temples on either side were built by his son and grandson. Inside are enshrined, again, statues of the Buddha depicted at various stages of his life. And the interesting thing about this particular project is the location where Abba Han chose to build his temple was on the site of the palace of the Yuan Hagans and the Mongol Empire, situated at the site of Karakoram, the ancient capital city of Mongolia. So I just want to show you what this looks like. Oh, and this is the statue of the Buddha that Abba Han enshrined within his central temple. I'm aware of time, but I would like to share this panoramic view, which was taken during the fieldwork project this summer. Give me 1 second. So what you can see here is the ruins of Karakoram, where the city once stood. And about to enter the shot is a platform where the giant 90-meter tall pagoda once stood. It's all been completely destroyed. And southwest of the city would have once stood the palace of the Mongol Hagans. And this is where Abba Han built his temple, Irten Jowo, and the Buddha within. And this is as it stands today. So intentionally erecting his temple on the seat of power of the ancient Mongol Khans, Abba Han also intended to establish his realm and his state as an independent, authentic Buddhist realm by taking on the model that Altan Han had created. Because of time, I'll stop there for now. And oops. So in this image, you can see the different Buddha statues of Irten Jowo temple complex in the central and the two side temples that were constructed by the descendants of Abba Han. So I'll stop sharing the examples of such Jowo temples and the purpose for which they were constructed there and come to my conclusion. Again, as I mentioned, there are many other examples, including the last Hagan to have the birthright to the title and position, even needing to take on or resort to the model that Altan Han had created. And in this image, and I know there are people in the room who are responsible for creating this map, so I'm very grateful for your work, depicts some of the temples in Mongolia and in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region or Southern Mongolia. So over the next few decades, Altan Han's utilization of the Buddhist monuments as embodiment of divine power and rulership extended far beyond his realm and those that were close to him. Before Altan Han, there had only been one Hagan and hardly any Hans, i.e. princes. But within decades of Altan Han's death, a whole host of new Hans emerged across the Mongolian realms. And aside from Altan Han's own successors, there were the Hans of Ortus, of Harchin, Arhorchin, and the Tushut and Sichin Hans. And again, I can continue with the list, but they refer to Hans that presided over various Mongolian administrative units. Like Altan Han had done, they all referred to the Gelug school and its leader, the Dalai Lama, for their Han titles and accompanying status of reincarnations of important Buddhist rulers and figures in the history of Buddhism, reaching back as far as India and the kingdoms of India. They presented themselves as Dharma Rajas, kings of the Dharma, and Chakravartins, world-turning monarchs. And like Altan Han, the first thing they did to support their new position was to build Buddhist temples to mark the center of their state, all titled Jowo. So within 2 decades after Altan Han's passing, at least 15 other Jowo temples were built by these new Hans. So in a sense, we can say that the very legacy that Altan Han left behind would be the undoing of the unity that he had hoped to achieve for his state. Nevertheless, it provided a model that would continue to influence the way Inner Asia and China would be organized. One thing was clear: despite there being all these other new Jowo temples being built, the Jowo that was built by Altan Han still continued to occupy a special position among the others. The most significant influence this had on the soon-to-be organization of China would be the arrival of the Manchus, who had established the Qing dynasty. So the first Qing ruler, or the first Manchu ruler, by the name of Hongtej, in 1632, rode into Hukhot for the first time and declared himself Altan Han's successor and the main patron of the Yekjo monastery that Altan Han had built, as well as promising to be an active patron of the Gelug school. He continued to rename Altan Han's monastery and gave it a new name, Chaglishugwesum, or Wuliangsi in Chinese. He set up a golden throne in front of the Jowo Śākyamuni statue and placed the golden plaque that he had written by hand at the temple's entrance that said, "Long live the emperor." Hongtej, the first Manchu emperor, who had no blood claim to the rulership of the Mongols, created his legitimacy as the Hagan, who would inherit the legacy of Kublai Khan and the Yuan Empire by partaking in this model that was created and disseminated by Altan Han, even though it might have been unintentionally following his death. And by so doing, the Qing were able to portray themselves as the legitimate rulers of the Qing Empire, the reincarnation or the rebirth of the Yuan dynasty. So I will stop there. I know I went over time a little bit, but for those of you who are interested in these temples and more information about the art and architecture, I can recommend this great book by Isabelle Charlus, written in French, The Temples and Monasteries of Inner Mongolia.
Thank you so very much, Professor Ujeed, for that fantastic talk. This has been the first talk in the Goodman series where we've had the chance to learn about Mongolia in such an in-depth and thorough way. So I just want to express my gratitude from all of us here for taking us on such a exciting, both historical and also geographic tour of these sites and how they fit in with the broader argument that you've raised here around the embodiment of statehood through this particular model of a kingdom and the key mode of centering, having that be centered on an image and its temple. So for all of you here now, this is the time in which I'm sure many of you have questions that you might like to ask Professor Ujeed. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a question, please send a chat message to KFQ&A, and then questions will be relayed to me, and I'll be able to pose some of those to our speaker today, depending on time. So I encourage you to continue to send those questions in. While we're waiting for questions to arrive, if you don't mind, I will begin with a couple of my own. So I was really struck by one line in your talk where you said that rebirth is not confined to individuals, but it's a process that we can understand with regards to sites, to the realm of geography as well. And your talk through all the different examples that you brought out really illuminated this in an important way. And I want to step back and think more broadly about the Buddhist world with you, if that's okay. Some of the models, this model of Altan Khan that then gets replicated in all these ways and contested or emulated or re-centered in these different ways that you illuminated for us, is worth thinking about in comparison with other parts of the Buddhist world that also engaged in using temples, using images, using particular models of statehood that re-centered the state on particular Buddhist sites as means of legitimating their rule or of promoting Buddhism in new kinds of ways. So one thing that struck me as quite distinct, for instance, compared to what happens in Southeast Asia, where there are important Buddha images that become the palladium, that become the palladia, the protective images of particular states. Those and the temples that hold them become sites of contestation, such that in stealing or in inviting a temple, an image out of one temple and into another, as it crossing from one polity to another, the new polity that now has the image gains the political power and gains this kind of authority over Buddhism. But in the examples that you brought up, it seems like this is an additive process. In other words, the authority comes from replicating the original, not appropriating it, and through the process of constructing an image and a temple anew. Can you say more about the importance of building a new Jowo each time? Why does it have to be rebuilt in these different ways? Why wasn't there this other kind of process that we see in other parts of the Buddhist world in which the images are mobile and therefore could be moved to different sites?
So as far as I'm aware, none of these Jowos were ever moved. And like you said, they were constructed anew. And I think it goes back to the model of the Jokhang and the Jowo in Lhasa. So that had been there since the 7th century. And this is what makes Tibet the second Bodh Gaya in the land of snows. And that too was something that was enshrined in Tibet. And these Jowos didn't have the sacredness that were endowed to them in China or Nepal until they were enshrined as such as the symbol of Songtsen Gampo and his state in Lhasa. So I guess from the Mongolian perspective in the 16th century, if the Jokhang and the Jowo was placed there, making a realm that was not Buddhist in any way, a central Buddhist place, then it can also be done in a different realm in the north. And in fact, the city of Altan Khan and his temple and the Buddha was oftentimes also referred to as the Bodh Gaya in the northern realm. So again, like I said, Altan Khan passed away very soon after the completion of this project. And over the next few years, many of these princes who had emulated him also passed away not long after their projects were completed. So again, there's disintegration going on as the power shifts from an individual to those who are competing for his position and so forth. And that's kind of part of the reason why these projects were being initiated one after the other in a very short period of time. And in a sense, I always kind of ask or ponder if Altan Khan had lived, what would have happened if he had lived slightly longer just to see this project come into maturation, or if any of his descendants or the figures who started such projects within the next 2 decades. I guess the example that prevailed is the Manchu Qing project, which allowed, a process of a series of events that would lead to the Qing governing China for the next 300 years.
On that note, I'm curious about the kinds of questions that also surface when visiting some of these sites in person, both recently in terms of this past summer in the Outer Mongolian context, but also other sites that you've have visited as you've thought about these questions. So the question of, would things have been different if Altan Khan had lived longer? Would that have changed what was going on? When looking at the sites in person, when considering the kinds of new archaeological data that you mentioned was quite important, how has this changed your perspective on these issues?
So the interesting part about traveling to these places and interacting with the pilgrimage makers, for them, these images and the sites are sacred because they represent certain periods of Buddhism spread in Mongolia and the accomplishments made by these figures who built them and supported them. And somehow there's not too much of an issue with there being multiple or it being a competing example, and there are many others. So for the Buddhists in these regions, it's not really an issue. It's as many as you can make a pilgrimage to, the more blessings you get, and the more the merrier, almost. Bear in mind, all of these statues are said to contain relics of the Buddha or important relics from the Buddhist tradition. So just by the virtue of that, they are also sacred embodiments of the supports of Buddhism. So someone else asked me this question before too, and I have been wondering, but I don't have a good answer yet of, they might be created as the center, but how is that perceived by the other regions and other neighboring nations? Is it also the case that these are sacred and are recognized as seats of power and centers of state, especially given that many of these aspiring states fell apart within years sometimes of them being constructed? But I don't quite have a good answer for that yet.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. And on this subject of specific sites, we have one audience member who's written in to say that they were lucky enough to travel to Mongolia in May 2022 at Erdene Jowo, or Erdene Zoll, spelled JUU/ZUU. We saw a small temple that was said to be the temple of the fifth Dalai Lama, but it was closed and we couldn't enter. Could you talk a little bit more about that temple?
So that temple is the temple of the fifth Dalai Lama. It's a reconstructed temple because that part was mostly destroyed during the socialist period. So the only original structures that survived were the three central Jewel temples. And although I showed you the video, I was unable to point out that the temple structures were many more during the height of Rinpoche's golden days, and many of those have not been reconstructed or rebuilt yet. And the reason why the fifth Dalai Lama's temple is currently shut is because the renovation projects are ongoing. There's also funding issues, so the inside is actually completely empty. So it's just the outer structure that currently remains. So it's just one of the many other temples and stupas that once stood at Rinpoche.
One aspect some audience members have been asking, like, what's distinctive in terms of what's happening in Buddhist practice and doctrine in Mongolia during some of the periods you've looked at. And one way of thinking about these kinds of questions is, in your talk, you illuminated for us how important to various local rulers, as well as those that held larger titles of Hagan, Khan, etc., these projects of having a temple that could embody their state was. What about for the pilgrimage, as these sites as pilgrimage sites today, or for the pilgrims who are visiting them? What's important, say, about the Jowo image or the temples that house them? How does it play a role in the lives of Mongolian Buddhists today, both in Inner Mongolia and in Mongolia country?
So throughout history, if one was able to go to Lhasa, or another holy site that was popular for the Mongols is Utaishan, the five-peaked mountain, just said to be the earthly abode of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, are popular pilgrimage sites. And it's said that if you visit those in person, then you'll definitely be reborn in a pure realm in your next life. So as well as these two, then some of these sites that were established by Altan Khan and others also came to be just as important. So there's sayings such as, if you can't make it to Lhasa, you can go to the Junjo. And this is actually another site which was in a slightly more northern Mongolian region known as Mongolian, and the temples there were referred to as the Eastern Jowo, whereas the Western Jowo would be the Jokhang and Jowo in Lhasa. So for pilgrimage makers who couldn't make it all the way there, then to see these images and pay their respects was enough to gain the same benefits and merit and so forth as going to the Bodh Gaya in the land of snow. You can go to Bodh Gaya in the northern realms.
And that same logic extends to the present, I presume?
Yes, actually. So there are pilgrimage makers, probably less in Inner Mongolia just because of the situation with religion and politics. But in Mongolia, especially when we were there were, multitudes of pilgrimage makers to Erdenjo and some of the other monastery sites that still survive there.
Wonderful. Well, we're unfortunately coming to the end of time here, so I'm sorry if you asked a question we didn't get a chance to answer it, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you again very much, Professor Sangseraima Ujeed, for the exceptionally illuminating talk and all of the images and video that you brought to us. For many of us here, this is the first time that we've been learning about this whole side and perspective on the Buddhist world. So you've really brought a lot of new questions and insights for us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I apologize for going over time a little bit. As I said, sometimes I get carried away with some of the things I talk about, but I hope, yeah, I had a great time, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I feel really fortunate I got to spend this time with all of you today. The next talk in our series will be by Professor Georgios Halkias. This will be on Saturday, February 24th at 10 a.m. Hong Kong time, or 9 p.m. on Friday, February 23rd, Eastern Standard Time. More information about Professor Halkias's talk will be forthcoming. As always, to stay in touch about upcoming events, please visit www.kenseifoundation.org to learn more about this series and other events hosted by the foundation. Thank you again for joining us. We hope we'll have a chance to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well.